Futures in Fundraising is presented by Alexander Haas. Alexander Haas, transforming institutions that transform lives.
Hi, and welcome back to Futures in Fundraising. Today, our guest is Rick Legon, who is the president of the Association of Governing Boards. Thanks, Rick, for being with us today.
It's good to be with you.
Rick, for anybody who might not know, maybe they've been living in a cave and just came out when they got a tax cut. Tell us about the Association of Governing Boards and what you guys do.
Thanks for that good question. The Association of Governing Boards is, now that you asked the question, I'm reminded that we're almost 100 years old.
Wow.
And we are an organization whose roots were in the Midwest. And then in the late 1960s, we moved to Washington, D.C. and began serving public and private, prior to that, just public, boards of trustees, boards of regents, curators, whatever they're called, the governing boards of colleges and universities. Our goal is to make sure that presidents and boards have an effective and open, a collaborative working relationship where there's trust and transparency. But we spend a lot of time on helping to educate the men and women who serve on those boards about what their responsibilities are, both the scope and the limits of their fiduciary responsibilities. Increasingly over the years, we've taken on some challenging issues that we think boards need to be aware of and engaged in. And we also have an aggressive public policy agenda at the federal level and at the state level, where a lot of governance initiatives take form at the state level. And under the construct that the influence of individual trustees or collective boards can be very effective in weighing in on important regulatory or legislative initiatives. So it's a fairly substantial agenda. We serve about 40,000 trustees and presidents, and some of the folks who we're talking to, leaders of cabinet members, fundraisers, et cetera, including those affiliated with public institution foundations.
So I know you weren't around when it happened, but what was the catalyst for forming the organization? Was there a crisis in governance, or was it just looking around the landscape and saying this can be done better?
It's a really great question. And next time you're in D.C., I'll show you the minutes from some of the very first meetings back in 1921.
Oh, wow.
So it was an organ. So think of the Big Ten, that neighborhood. And it really was a very informal kind of a rump gathering of the board chairs of those institutions, the Midwest and that general neighborhood, but public institutions, because really they were, it wasn't that a particular challenge or threat, although you could read about some of the areas that they were concerned about, but it really was just a sharing of what are you seeing in higher ed? How effective is your board? What are your leadership challenges? How do you cope with? How do you engage with your institution's administrators? It was a changing time, and governance, if you just track governance over the last, we've been doing it the same way for 300 years, essentially. But if you just go back 100 years, you could look at critical moments in U.S. history, and for each of those, you could see a parallel change in the level of board expectation, board engagement. And so that was probably one as well. And don't be too sure. I may have been there. I've been here a long time. I've been here a long time.
I was trying to be kind.
Yeah, I know. But Father Time is not.
Well, I would imagine at that time, as is the case now, that most of those presidents and board chairs who got together were working with boards that were appointed by the governor or some other state body, as opposed to recruited because of needs on the board itself.
Sure. Yeah, they were, and they still are.
Yeah.
Public board members are are fewer in number. Their boards are dramatically smaller on average than private institution boards. But most, if not all, public boards, especially two-year institutions, of course, are selected through some political appointment process, be it the governor in most cases. Some states have the legislature play a central role, and there are still several states where board members are elected either through at a congressional district level or even statewide. So there's all manner on the public side. On the private side, it's self-perpetuating. They replace themselves.
So I know that recently AGB has put a lot of focus on pushing particularly higher education, but probably others too, into what you guys call consequential governance. And I wondered if you could, tell us a little bit about what you mean when you say consequential governance and what led AGB into a focus on that.
Yeah, great question again. So a number of years ago, we were looking at the overall performance of boards. And if you see a board perform, they are public or private. They are made up of men and women who are committed to doing good things. I mean, most boards really care. These are volunteers, regardless of how they get there. They're giving their own time. Some give their own resources, but they want to do well. And they want to do good. It's not good use of English, but they do. It works. Boards want to do good. And yet the history, I mentioned a little while ago that we've been doing governance essentially the same way, really for over 300 years. We do board governance the way we did it for the colonial colleges before the formation of the country and the Constitution, quite honestly, if you read up on it. So as the issues grew more complex and challenging and controversial in terms of higher education, with an increasing questioning by the public and by policy leaders about how higher ed was doing, obviously every now and then some above-the-fold stories that really brought the reputation not only of an institution, but through that institution impacted the reputation of higher education. Most normally, those always defaulted into governance failures. So we decided that what we needed to do was to ask a question, and that was whether or not in the 21st century, the model and the approach by which governing boards do their work is as relevant and appropriate for the challenges that higher ed is facing as they were over the course of the last 100 or 200 years. And so we established a national commission, very independent from AGB. It was chaired by the former governor of Tennessee, Phil Bredesen, had 26 people on it. And over 13 months and hearings all over the country and a lot of candor in its meetings, they came to the conclusion that the answer was no, that the structure works, the concept of independent boards works, but boards needed to step up their level of engagement. The higher education that they knew, or that we all knew over the last 50, 60 years or more, where a steady diet of students who are going to come to your place, increase in state support for higher education.
Healthy state funding, which is
no pushback on tuition increases. Just a very happy story about higher ed was coming into question. And to address those challenges, the commission said boards need to focus on things that truly matter. In the first the first recommendation in the report on consequential boards basically says that boards have a responsibility to spend their time on things that matter. Now, some folks have said to me, that says absolutely nothing.
It's pretty broad.
And I say no, because every institution's definition of what matters has to be determined by that institution. What matters for your place and what matters for my place could be similar or vastly different. The purpose of a consequential board, however, is to be engaged in the conversation about what are the strategic areas that do matter and will matter, not what did matter, but prospectively. And how do we as a board deploy ourselves, get out from under staff reports that overly dominate our committees, where we are more of an audience than a fiduciary body? Right. And how do we really engage? And so consequential boards is an urging for boards to respect their fiduciary duties in a legal sense and to be more appropriately engaged, not to run the place. We don't need co-presidents in the boardroom. But what we do need are boards. When boards ask me or presidents ask me, hey, Rick, what is the most compelling variable that defines an effective board? I respond by saying curiosity. Boards need to ask the right questions, the uncomfortable questions. They need to be more fundamentally engaged. They need to rethink their board structure. The standard structure of the committees in most boards are so yesterday that it almost precludes the ability of a board to do what we're talking about. I'm on the board of a place called Spelman College, which is a women's HBCU in Atlanta, and we came off of the standard 7 or 8 standing committees that we have to having only 4 or 5 committees today. And we are a much better, much more appropriately engaged board. And we deal on things that matter. Yeah. That's what consequential boards is.
I think there was a big move, and some of it's still underway, to push so much work to committees that the actual board meetings became rote report out meetings.
Yeah.
I think sort of, to me, the death of governance is the consent agenda.
Yeah, I actually like consent agendas with the right things on it, but I take your point. I understand where you go, and you're right. The second day, I call it the second day snooze. The first day boards are into the right things if they're structured.
Committee meetings, there's content, there's dialogue, there's stuff
back
going
and
on.
Forth. But the second day, you can get to sleep real fast if it's just a report out from the committee. So, so much of it, you're really hitting on the right point. So much of it has to do with what is the agenda. And it starts with what are the issues that you want the board to weigh in on or share thoughts about. We've been encouraging boards to have the non-agenda agenda, where a part of the board's time is devoted to issues that board members are just thinking about. We do that here at AGB. We try to model best practice, and I'll tell you, and our board does really good work, but the most interesting for them and helpful to us time is on the front end of the actual board meeting after the consent agenda, where it's just free for all. And we get a real sense, our board members are trustees from around the country. Mm-hmm. We get a real sense of what the issues are and what they're thinking about and concerned about in ways that the kind of structure you're talking about could hamper if we didn't allow for it. So boards need to be creative, and you're right. Too much committee work. Committee work is important. Too much of it chills the ability of a board to be strategic as an entity. It takes work.
Yeah, I guess the consent agenda meetings that I've been involved with tended to be a meeting where the board voted on an agenda, and then the entire rest of the meeting was devoted to somebody essentially reading the reports.
Yeah, and that's I actually sat in. I feel your pain. I sat in on a board meeting one time of a public institution where the president asked me to sit in and see how ineffective that particular board is. And so they started with the presentation of a consent agenda. And a member of the board raised her hand and opposed the contents of the consent agenda, which began about an hour-long debate on the elements in the consent agenda. And so you can see that would just roll out. So, I tell you, one of the things that is just so important, and I'm happy that more boards are finally taking it to heart, is the content of the board's agenda, the ability to really create an engaging environment, because so many of them are static and pro forma, yep. And one meeting is the same as the next. Yep. And I tell you, you're asking very busy people to add value, and after a while, they get it if they're not being valued,
and they won't come back.
Yeah, some of them have to fly to a meeting, yeah. And they begin to question, why the heck am I getting on this airplane to go if it's just going to be a performance?
I'm going to go to dinner.
We're seeing, to their credit, we're seeing more and more boards rethink the structure of their committees. And it's to their credit. And when they get there, they tell us that there's more engagement, there's more strategy, there's more forward thinking. And there's more time for the board as a board to have important conversations. And that's really what we're talking about.
Great. We're going to take a really short break, and then we'll be right back with more from Legon.
Two people that I have to say have been very influential in my fundraising career. One, Henry Clay Hoffheimer, he was in Norfolk, Virginia. He chaired my campaign at the hospital, and then he was also honorary chair of the campaign at Old Dominion University where I worked. Magnificent individual, wonderfully generous, a very astute businessman, and a terrific solicitor. The second was probably my first boss in fundraising, who came to me at one point and said, would you like to be director of development? And I thought that'd be great. I'd love to be director of something. What's a director of development? In my early 20s. And I soon learned that meant you had to ask for money. Her name was Noelle Stanek, and she went from being a boss to a really close friend, and now we talk several times a week, even though we haven't lived in the city for many years. But again, incredibly knowledgeable, passionate, and wonderful in being able to reinforce and understand the basics of fundraising.
All right, we are back with Rick Legon from the Association of Governing Boards talking about good governance. We've been talking some about higher education governance, and one of the hot buttons right now, Rick, as you well know in higher education, is the cost of attendance and conversations about the increasing cost of attendance. So is that sort of thing part of what you guys focus on at AGB too?
We spend a lot of time on affordability, which has multiple levels, and it's a bit different in public higher education from private higher education.
Definitely.
And there's also a bit of misunderstanding in the general public about cost. Cost is not price. And we do have to be clear on our terms. The price of a higher education at many, many places. I mean, if you want to go to an elite institution, go. And if you pay a lot, you pay a lot. But you've committed to doing that. Even those places can do needs blind kind of opportunities as well. But cost and price are vastly different. The sticker price and the net tuition price plus room and board are just
fractions of one another. Yeah,
that's one. Two, this is a central issue. It's a major concern. We see a lot of challenges and articles about student debt. The truth about student debt is that it has become hyperbolic, and the realities of students taking out debt for those students who attend and get a degree to succeed in a 4 or 6 year traditional bachelor's program. The debt is over a lifetime rather de minimis. The stories of $1 trillion worth of debt. There's a bit of political hyperbole there, and it also doesn't exclude the reality of the debt that's taken out for those who go to for-profit institutions. So that's an area. In terms of the cost itself, and then the price, certainly in public higher education, which is where nearly 80% of our students attend, where it's where they go, we're fighting the wrong fight. So we talk about price as we talk about cost as a synonym to price, and we just touched upon that. But even the price of a public higher education is been predicated on a cost shift. Students are now required to pick up what over the last 10, 12, maybe more years of declining state public support for higher education, which is among the areas of funding that are discretionary for states.
Right.
And so if states are getting out of the business of funding higher education, the actual net cost of a higher education hasn't increased all that dramatically over the last number of years. Price has in publics because of the cost shift.
The funding gap.
So now that's complicated. How do you have that conversation with the general public? It's very, very challenging. And we're calling upon trustees to help interpret that, because the general public, even policymakers, are more likely to listen to trustees who come from the external community than they might be from internal institutional leaders. As articulate as those good folks are, we need to have more trustees share their voices about higher education. So the cost price thing is we need to be sensitive about it. It's not a non-issue, but there are layers to it. You need to unpeel it before you really get too attached to it as a huge issue. It is still, higher education is still one of the best buys in terms of the return on the investment.
Lifetime earnings, yes.
It's lifetime earnings, it's engagement, it's increased public funding through folks who have good jobs and pay taxes. It results in healthier citizens, more engaged citizens in civic and community affairs, the perpetuation of values that are important to society. It's a pretty good buy. So, the cost thing, trustees, boards need to be sensitive to it. They need an affordable product because we're marketing, it's a highly competitive industry. So you need your students, prospects to come to your place rather than my place. But it's an issue that is complicated and misunderstood by way too many people.
Well, and then on the private side, you have the whole discount rate situation, which is very misunderstood in the general public. It's kind of a shell game. Tuition's $60,000, but nobody pays that. The average student pays $25 or whatever the numbers may be. It's just I found.
Yeah, I know at our place. I'm not going to give you the inside scoop on Spelman, but I'll tell you that the average Spelman woman, it's a women's college, as I said, is probably paying less than half of the sticker price at most.
Well, you may be aware that Sweetbriar College in Virginia just reset their tuition back to what the average student pays and said, we're going to quit with all of this. Everybody gets a 50% scholarship, and just here's what it costs.
Yeah, and Sweetbriar, Sweetbriar has had its own, challenges over the last 3 years, but I think that's a pretty smart way to go.
Yeah.
What it does do, however, is, so they're doing it for a marketing effort, of course. What it does do is it removes the capacity to recruit students whose families could pay the full ride at the high end, which cuts into resources that then support the discount rate and other scholarships. So they have to manage it all.
And I think at a lot of institutions, they do the analysis and realize, we've actually had clients where almost zero students were actually paying the full tuition.
Oh, yeah.
And I've had discussions with presidents about, well, why don't you just put the tuition what it should be? And frankly, then we wouldn't look as prestigious as our peers who are charging
Yeah,
this much
true.
money.
They play the ratings games
Absolutely.
too. So there's so many and variables to it. It's a hard case. It's the toughest conversation to have about our business.
So on this issue of price and cost, I want to ask you about, and I'm going to read a little bit here because I don't want to misrepresent this, about an article that James Koch wrote recently entitled "No College Kid Needs a Water Park to Study." And I know you've read this article. Some of our viewers might not have, but essentially he was sort of taking a tongue-in-cheek shot, maybe not so tongue-in-cheek shot, at Alabama, Iowa, Missouri, LSU, who all recently installed sort of lazy river rides on campus, funded out of student fees, which are a cost of attendance issue, as we just talked about. And his point he was making is, does a lazy river ride that costs, $20 or $30 million funded by student fees, is that really adding value to the education of the students? And shouldn't the trustees, his words, not mine, I'm asking you, shouldn't the trustees, ask some questions about this and challenge this, and maybe, I think he was trying to get at sort of rein in some of this crazy spending that really doesn't enhance the value of the education. I know you've had a chance to look at that. Maybe as you read through that, how did you react to that? What are your thoughts on that take?
Just to be a little provocative, I know that I think I recall that the author was once the president of the University of Montana. I spent a lot of time.
That's right.
I spent a lot of time in Montana and at the University of Montana. And in the narrative of the piece, he also questions the balancing of expenses between education programs and athletics programs.
Right.
I would doubt that, and Montana is a big-time Div 1 athletic institution, and I have no doubt that when he was the president of that institution, he saw the value of investing in athletics and balanced it in some way with the educational program. So, and I don't fault him for that because it is a big draw and the community's into it. What I find challenging is, or of concern, and you're right, I don't know what institution needs a lazy river or a climbing wall in every dorm or the student union. But I do know this. I know that each and every institution understands what it takes to compete. And each and every institution today is competing for customers. They want students. And if there is an assessment that among the more marketable things that they might be able to put out there to attract students who will more than pay the cost of this investment, whether it's a lazy river, which I've never had a chance to be on, I'd love to be on one, or some other investment that to the outside world may look frivolous and totally unrelated to the athletic, I'm stuck in athletics, on the academic focus of the institution, it's too easy to question it because it looks so out of bounds. And yet I would submit, especially since it does need to be approved by boards, that one, there's hard questions as to what we're going to build, what, why does it add value? Why does it make sense? And I'm sure that in most, if not all of these instances, they were fairly considered and implemented. Keep in mind that 80% of the revenues that come into every institution, even more, are devoted to or targeted both to personnel and also even more than that to personnel in the education or the academic side of the house. But more and more, we talked about it a moment ago, where there's this cost shift. More and more of these institutions need to compete. And if judgments are made in institution A that we need to add some amenities or invest more in Division I football, even if they've never had football, or whatever else it is to to strengthen our competitive position vis-a-vis our peers or aspirant institutions, it may strike the outside world as frivolous and unnecessary and wasteful, and a fee that students shouldn't have to pay. But I wouldn't want to judge too harshly those institutions, because I dare say they are, with rare exception, and I don't know the exceptions, giving all of it consideration. It is easy to write as an ex-president all of the failures that the probability is that good Dr. Koch here also had to deal with when he was in his 2 presidencies. So I think it's a little bit of piling on based on news reports rather than budgets and strategic direction. A little unfair.
I always say it's easier to run for president than to be president.
Exactly. And so I just take exception to the premise. Yeah, you don't want student fees piling on. I get it. Student fees, I think, are can be a real problem, and institutions need to be wary. But I would doubt very much. I'll tell you this: if it was really an ugly scenario where it looked as if students were being ripped off and it was a misallocation of funds, there is no doubt that the legislature in each of those respective states would be calling for an investigation, and some state legislator would promulgate legislation proposed to curtail the authority of a governing board. And I haven't seen it in any of those states. So I think those stories need to be attended to, but it's a little bit aggressive.
So I want to ask you one more thing as we close up here, and back to the idea of the price. And I think your explanation of the difference, that the cost hasn't necessarily grown up dramatically, but the price to the student or the family has, as that has shifted. I think that's a really good point to make. I happen to be, have gone to college on student loans because that was the way I could go to college, and I graduated from college, and I paid those off over time, and adjusted from inflation for the 30 years that I've been out of college, my student loan debt probably was, on par with what the average debt is now.
No doubt.
Much smaller number then, but much different, inflationary times.
Sure.
So I say that to say that I'm not always maybe as sympathetic as I should be about using debt to fund education, because it actually worked for me, and I had debt and I paid it off. But what I anticipate happening, because I don't envision in the environment we're in state or federal allocations to higher education turning around and starting to increase again. I mean, they've been decreasing for, the better part of almost 2 decades now, right? And,
I think so.
And I think that's probably likely to continue. So that price, even if we hold the cost, the price is going to continue to go up. Are we pushing the price of higher education out of the reach of the middle class and lower middle class people who don't qualify for Pell Grants and those kind of programs?
Yeah. It's the exact right question, and I think you can make the argument that in some communities, yes, the answer to your good question is yes. And we are watching some institutions be rather strategic on reimagining the price. It's not easy, obviously. Faculty want to get paid. These are staff-driven operations to get all that. But in terms of how they build the academic program, so we've seen, obviously you're aware of it, we've seen credits for competency-based experience. We've seen shortening time to degree and other kinds of
online learning.
Yeah, sorry, online learning, absolutely. And things that we haven't even thought about yet that are in the hopper. So I think that higher education, which over many years has been a source of continuous change and innovation, that's not escaping them. You know, we're going through in Congress the next beyond tax reform, which has a very uncertain impact ultimately.
That's
on
another.
higher
We'll have to do
education.
another conversation about that
Yeah,
6 or 7 months from now and see where that goes.
Yeah, no, but you'll see how it came out. But the next thing up is the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act, and just looking at the frameworks there is kind of a stored up hostility on the part of policymakers. True, policymakers, because higher ed doesn't have a lot of allies and advocates outside of the academy. So you're right. That's a separate story.
But I feel too like some of them haven't heard the great explanation you gave us about the difference between cost and price.
Probably not. I want to be fair. They probably heard it. They just don't get it and they don't believe it, because their constituents have concerns about the value prop of higher ed. So it's kind of, it kind of flows. So I get that. But to answer your question, yes. Having said what I said about cost and price, the price is going up, and so institutions. You know, we have an increasingly diverse population. We've got to make sure that our institutions are price sensitive and welcoming to include young men and women, and older men and women. It's not just 18 to 24-year-old population coming to our institutions. We have to increasingly be certain that the affordability is inviting for people of diversity who need to find a way into the middle class, which, after all, has been the construct of higher ed. Come to higher ed and you will have that start in life. We got to make sure we don't lose sight of that. And some institutions are more aggressive about it. I think accreditors are pushing on that. And on the good side of where I see the Higher Ed Act coming, there may be some pressure on that front as well.
Great. Well, Rick, I appreciate you joining us today. It's been a great conversation. I think we could probably start over again and go down a different path and do this for the rest of the afternoon. It's really
let's do it again.
Great to talk to somebody who's really knowledgeable about this, and governance is so important. And so thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for including me. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
And for all of you, join us next time for Futures in Fundraising.